All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. This event is being recorded, and we'll be able to publish it after the event. Hello, and welcome to Building the Next Economy with Natalie Foster. I'm John Lund Della Osa, a third-year evening and weekend MBA candidate here at Berkeley Haas, and a student board member for the Center for Responsible Business. Today, we'll be exploring the creation of the Guarantee Economy with Natalie Foster, president of the Economic Security Project and author of The Guarantee, Inside the Fight for America's Next Economy. For students here today, please make sure that you get a copy of the guarantee at the back with Persis. We've been looking forward to this crucial conversation for months and are so excited you're here with us. This event serves as the third installment of our Rethinking Capitalism and the American Business School series. And it continues our work in exploring our role in shaping business school education, redefining the social responsibility of business, and building the movement to create the future that we need. Today's agenda is simple. Professor Joe Giesler will moderate a conversation with Natalie about her work and the guarantee, and then we'll open up for audience questions at about 6. At 6:30, we'll break for the social component of this event in recognition that creating social bonds between us is a critical component of the work itself, but honestly, I just wanted to hang out with all of you. Before you leave tonight, please make sure that you fill out the QR codes posted around this room. This both helps us, actually it's going to be on the slide, this helps us design these events, and if you leave your email address, you can join our movement in creating a coalition for responsible business as we seek to connect folks working on this topic from all perspectives. Before we begin, I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement of where we're holding this event. The Center for Responsible Business recognizes that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the original landscape of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This region continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. We've invited Natalie Foster here today to illuminate a path forward for us in creating a more caring, just economy that brings well-being to its center. Her work, and even embedded in the title of her book, is a fight. It's a fight centered in love against the violence created by the norms of our current economic system. To paraphrase systems thinker Indy Johar, mission steward of Dark Matter Labs, we've been experiencing an accumulation of violence through our current economic system. Violence has been accruing through its inherent design as it builds and layers on itself on how we treat ourselves and our planet. Violence in our current neoliberal economic system doesn't have to look like murder on the street. It comes in the form of denied health care coverage and evictions from housing and predatory loans and crushing debt, and the suffocation and squeezing out of folks' ability to live a life of well-being. It comes through the forced labor that is mining resources for our tech, sewing the clothes that we wear, and harvesting the sugar for our soda. It looks like centuries of funding genocide and forced displacement of indigenous people all over the world. It looks like clearing forests and draining groundwater aquifers for cattle, like spewing carbon into the air and dumping trash in the ocean. It looks like food apartheid, the for-profit incarceration system, corporate monopolistic practices, and the embrace of the neoliberal mandate to maximize shareholder profit above all else. And yes, this violence looks like the bullshit claims that immigrants are eating neighborhood pets and that cisgender women aren't safe from trans women in bathrooms. It looks like throwing the Nazi salute on a national stage. It looks like corporate acquiescence to hate and deporting people from the crime of trying to live. The violence is growing, and through a systems perspective, has been accumulating for centuries, and we play a role in this violence. The reality that we face today is that this accumulation of violence is now looping back into the system. The assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson and ensuing public support for Luigi Mangione affirms this idea that the public has had enough. As a business school, a university, as students and as community members, we're faced with the question, what's next? And what's our role in this? I offer that through the lens of today's economic system, we take a different direction. We must be radicals. We must be radical in dreaming of a better, caring, empathetic, and grounded economy. Radical in organizing and supporting our siblings across our communities and creating communities of care. radical in implementing change through local legislation, our institutions, our education, and the design of our businesses to prove that systemic violence is untenable in a caring and just economy. This radicalism is demonstrated no better than by Natalie Foster, her book, The Guarantee, and her work at the Economic Security Project. Natalie and ESP have shown that there is a way forward. No pitchforks, no complacency, no acquiescence. We will have our revolution, and it will look like communities coming together to dream, to organize, then prove that systems change and building a new economy is possible by holding our institutions accountable to their responsibilities. Natalie is a crucial part of this conversation, and we're honored that she's here with us tonight. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Natalie Foster and Joe Giesler and share a little bit about each of them. If you'd like to come up, I'll go through this. Natalie Foster is a leading architect of a movement to build an inclusive and resilient economy. She's the president and co-founder of Economic Security Project and an Aspen Institute Future of Work Senior Fellow. Natalie previously founded the Sharing Economy Community Peers, co-founded Rebuild the Dream with Van Jones, and served as digital director for President Obama's Organizing for America, a leading partner in winning transformative healthcare reform. A daughter of a preacher from Kansas, Natalie draws on the values of community, dignity, and optimism to build a better America. Joe Giesler is currently a lecturer at UC Berkeley Haas, teaching responsible business leadership and ESG-aligned corporate governance. She holds an MBA from Wharton, and among many executive-level positions focused on human rights, served as the head of global citizenship at global law firm White & Case, where she built one of the first comprehensive ESG initiatives and led the firm's relationship with the UN and the decision process for becoming a signatory to the UN Global Compact in 2016. She created a course at Columbia, but moved here 2 years ago and is delighted to be teaching here at Berkeley. Go Bears. Please give a warm welcome to Natalie and Joe. Thank you both.
Thank you, John. I am the niece of a pastor from Ohio.
Oh.
So you're stuck with us for the next hour and a half.
That's right.
Delighted to be here, to meet you, and to walk us through this discussion, this dialogue. I just want to say one thing up front. The elephant on the table is that we're in a new Trump administration. And the book was written before that, although not much before that. It is hot off the press. And I want to make sure that we go through the concepts and give them their due and understand what the promise is, what the potential is, what the approaches are, what the goals are, and then come back and say, okay, so how is this affecting you today, this new environment that you're in, for however long, but not forever?
That's right.
So let's start with the basics. Tell us, what is the guarantee?
I will. First, I just want to say thank you, John, for having me. And it's just a pleasure to be here with you on this Thursday evening as the sun is setting and our state is still burning. And a second plane has been sort of rerouted, I heard, in Washington, D.C. So there's just a lot going on, and I appreciated John's opening words that grounded us right here and now. And I do think the one thing we know about this moment is coming together to dream and build connection and build community is the most important thing. So it's an honor to be here. So what is the guarantee? The guarantee is arguing that we should have a North Star in the American economy that should be about guaranteeing human flourishing. My colleague, Derek Hamilton, mentor really, he's an economist, and he'll often be in rooms of economists, and he'll say, what is the point of the economy? People will kind of look and offer some numbers and some graphs. He's like, no, the point of the whole thing is human flourishing. And that is what the richest nation on earth, in the richest moment in history, right, this country could decide we're going to build a floor through which no one can fall. We are going to guarantee things like housing and healthcare and family care and good work. We're going to guarantee income. We're going to guarantee an inheritance known as a baby bond. Those are just a few examples of what you could imagine guaranteeing. the floor, not the ceiling. It's not saying this is what everybody has to have. It's saying this is a floor through which no one can fall, and that it's possible to do in this country. And prototypes are actually being born today in cities and states across the country. And that during the pandemic, when we understood ourselves to be in an extreme crisis, we did much of it at the federal level. We saw the beginnings of a guarantee economy, which says to me that we can do it again. We have a blueprint. We just need the political will to get there. So that's the guarantee economy.
So give us a couple of examples. I'm going to ask you, like, why do you believe so strongly in it at all? But first, make it even more concrete for us. What's an example guarantee?
Yeah.
You have so many examples in your book.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you start seeing examples of guarantees, you realize they're kind of everywhere. And the place I'll start is business, actually. Business in America enjoys significant guarantees to ensure that it can operate, that businesses can operate and flourish in this country, right? The guarantee of patents, the guarantee of the court system, the guarantee of a stable monetary system with an entire institution and central bank built to ensure monetary stability, the guarantee of shareholder liability, that I'm not held responsible for any wrongdoing that a corporation does if I'm a shareholder. All those things are guaranteed and many more. And so I'm arguing we should extend those guarantees to the everyday people who make up the economy, who build the economy from the ground up. So where could you, and we don't, like, it's not the way we've understood the economy, right? My lifetime really corresponds with the rise of neoliberalism in America. Call it trickle-down economics, call it Reaganomics. It's a real clear sense that we should have total faith in the market, zero faith in government, and a story to people that it's your job to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's been the story of the American economy, right? That it's like the weather. It just happens to us. And so I think understanding guarantees is a real shift in how we think. So here's an example. I've traveled the country this year talking to a lot of people about the economy. And I know a lot of people my age are waking up at night wondering how they're going to handle long-term care for their parents, right? We're the sandwich generation where we're going to be taking care of our parents and we're taking care of young children. Certainly childcare care is an extraordinary expense, both finding the care and then if you are a caregiver, being able to pay for rent and keeping, a house over your head with rates that are so meager. And in Washington State, there is an example of a guarantee called Washington Cares. And it's a long-term care social insurance program. Okay, so everyone in Washington pays in with a small payroll tax. And when you need long-term care, you're able to pull from the social insurance program. So we're sort of pooling our risk. None of us know when we're going to need long-term care or when a loved one will need long-term care. And so when that moment hits, there's a program to pull from to be able to afford it. Right? That's just one example of what a guarantee could look like in this country if we decided to orient in that direction.
Great example. So clearly, you are an excellent spokesperson for this concept, and you believe very strongly in it. But you know that it's bucking up against what you have rightly described as kind of the whole mindset and the whole paradigm on which our economy has been built. How do you counter the naysayers? What data do you use? What's the rationale for why this is the right answer? A moral answer, an ethical answer, yes, that's a different question. But for people who wouldn't be motivated by that and are more like, I see other arguments there. What about individual initiative? What about, not creating dependence? What about, how, I know that you know that, or have research that shows that those things are not necessarily the outcomes. Dependence, for instance. What are they? Share them with us. What's the most compelling data that you have?
for a floor. So when people have economic security, they're able to live lives of dignity and agency and pursue dreams in a more meaningful way. Let's start with a guarantee of income. So I wrote the book because I've been heads down for the past decade working on this idea of guaranteed income. It sort of came out of universal basic income, this idea that everyone should have a check that sits alongside your wages that comes in every month that you can count on. And there's no strings attached. You can use the money however you want. It's like a wealthy person would have dividends, right? Money they didn't work for, but it flows into their account and they spend it how they want. That everyone should have that. So we've been demonstrating this idea, worked closely with Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton, California, who was one of the youngest mayors in American history. And we sat next to each other at a conference like this, and I was like, we're looking for a city who wants to demonstrate a guaranteed income. And he's like, oh, I read Dr. King's last book. Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Dr. King lays out the need, the moral imperative for a guaranteed income as a way of abolishing poverty. And I knew that was something I wanted to demonstrate in my city. So we worked together and launched one of the first demonstrations in America. In Stockton, 125 families received $500 a month with no strings attached. We didn't deal with the guarantee of healthcare or housing or any of the other guarantees. We were just focused on a guaranteed income. And after a few months, people really reported significant less stress, right? The well-being of families and individuals was higher. People reported being able to sleep through the night better than they had with just that bit more of security in their lives. We saw other data that, people went to the dentist and the doctor more often for preventative visits and to the emergency room less often. One non-obvious finding is that people found full-time work at double the rate than the control group did. And the reason is because people had more time to invest in themselves, right? To go to a job interview on a Saturday morning instead of door dashing to make that extra bit of money to be able to make rent. People had time to spend with their children or to go get a suit for a job interview, like those kinds of things. And so that's some of the data we know when people have economic security. So I think there are absolutely moral reasons, and I think there are also, frankly, business reasons for this. We know that over the last several decades, the small business licensing has gone down. The number of small businesses being created has gone down. And that is a real concern to people who believe that the future of American economic growth is entrepreneurialism and is small businesses across this country. And during the pandemic, when we sent people child tax credit checks, which was a guaranteed income, when there was a baseline of healthcare, right? Medicaid expanded when people lost their jobs. Millions of people lost their jobs overnight. And instead of a great crisis where we had, more uninsured Americans than at any point in history, in fact, we defied gravity. It was the opposite. We had the lowest number of uninsured Americans in history because we expanded the Affordable Care Act to catch people. And so during that period, when there was a number of guarantees in place, we actually saw small business creation go up 21%. And that has continued year after year after year since the pandemic. And that's because people had a bit more security. They had a guarantee, they had a floor. Venture capitalist Roy Bahat, who runs Bloomberg Beta, which is Bloomberg's early stage venture fund, calls this the trampoline economy. It's not a safety net. It's a trampoline, right? People touch down in that moment and then can jump right back up to pursue the life that they want.
You make a really good point in the book about what a great laboratory the pandemic was. And because of the crisis, so many of these types of programs are embraced. So we've now shown that leadership of all stripes, because we had 2 different administrations during COVID, would embrace, and President Trump, the first time, signed his names to those checks that went out, right?
The stimmies.
So he was on board with that. But crisis motivated that, right? So how does the work go now? Again, putting aside the current administration, but how do you build the support for doing it outside of a time of crisis?
Yeah.
Because I think the mindset's different, right?
It is. But the thing that's important to realize is that when the pandemic hit, these things didn't just fall from the sky. These lawmakers looked for ideas that were tested and tried and true and had a body of evidence and moved those forward. And they existed because advocates and activists around the country had been laying the groundwork and building the seeds and building the prototypes that could be scaled at the federal level. There is a direct line between what Michael Tubbs was doing in Stockton, California, and the child tax credit checks. You guys, just weeks after Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which included the child tax credit checks, right, the expanded child tax credit checks, the IRS was sending checks and debiting the accounts of every parent in America. I'm sorry, crediting the accounts. Somebody called me out recently. I was like, crediting the accounts.
It's a debit card,
it's
but
a debit card
uses debit in the opposite way, as this audience knows.
There we go, yeah. That is government working in people's lives. And, you know, it went fast. Nobody stood in lines to fill out forms. Nobody had inspectors coming into their homes to find out how they used the money. There was a sense of trust that you know best how to manage your own financial life, and what you need is money. That's what you're lacking. And so we're gonna send it out. There is a direct line between what Michael Tubbs was doing and those expanded child tax credit checks, right? If you have 2 small children, it was $500 a month with no strings attached. And so my point is that social change isn't linear, and none of us could have foreseen that crisis. But the work we had been doing year after year meant that in that moment, lawmakers picked those ideas up and they moved them forward. And there's a blueprint that I think is just the beginning, not the ceiling, not the best we can ever do, but in a moment of crisis, the blueprint for what the guarantees could look like.
So remind me, the categories of guarantees are income, inheritance, healthcare, 2 more?
Well, I tracked 7 in the book.
7, okay.
And what I'm naming is not that these are the 7 and this is the 7-point plan and, you know, where that's it. It's more like this is a paradigm shift away from neoliberalism toward a guarantee economy. And these are 7 where we've seen that progress from an idea, a white paper. Can we take a second and talk about baby bonds?
Oh, I was going to ask, tell us about, when you do that,
Yeah.
talk about inheritance, baby bonds, and what they've done in Connecticut.
I will.
Which is a great example.
It is a great example. And
you have to wait for the Connecticut story.
It's also a really clear example of how you go from white papers, ideas, like here in the academy, right, that are written, to an actual provocation of the idea, to legitimizing it, and then creating it in a policy in just a few short years. So I think this is a guarantee that is sort of the earliest in its life cycle. Several years ago, Derek Hamilton, a professor at the New School who runs the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, and Sandy Darity in North Carolina wrote a white paper about the racial wealth gap in America, right? The fact that the average white family has 10 times the wealth of the average black family in this country. And that's wealth, not income, right? When you focus on jobs and guaranteed income, we're looking at income disparity, which is much less, which pales in comparison to the wealth disparities in this country. And an idea like a baby bond, which says every child deserves a bond, a trust in their name that they can access, an inheritance, a seed fund that they can access when they turn 18 or 21. That is a nest egg allowing them to pursue an MBA, buy a car to get to work, buy a home whatever it is you might do as a young person to take a risk on yourself, that everyone deserves that. And there's a way to do this. We can create a bond, we can create trust accounts for every child, and then based on the parent's income, can fill the trust with up to $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 that every child could have, when they turn 18.
And make sure you point out that, like the guarantees you talked about for corporations, remember there are things in the tax code that people with income can take advantage of that we don't think anything about. So what is it, the 529 savings account that you can put money away, tax deferred, for your child when they're born to pay for their college, right? But if you don't have any disposable income, you can't take advantage of that.
So I think that's a great point.
That, to me, is the most compelling one to open one's mind to how do you level that playing field, because everybody else has a tax-advantaged way to save for college.
Yes.
Aside from like free community college or free state schools, which is a different approach.
Yes. I would like to shout out a book called The Whiteness of Wealth by Dorothy Brown, who is a tax scholar. I highly recommend it. And her book, it goes into detail about how the tax code really services wealth, particularly white wealth, but middle income, higher income wealth, and reinforces it. And it was very eye-opening.
You don't even have to go to the perspective of what the tax code, who it's benefiting, to just say that the tax code is designed to drive policy. Always has been. We use the tax code to drive certain behaviors for corporations and from individuals. In the 70s,
like home ownership.
Like home ownership. That's why you have the mortgage interest deduction, because the government wants to promote home ownership, make it more affordable, right? Also why they have Fannie Mae, right, to guarantee, to make it more widely available. But again, only good if you have income and qualify for a mortgage. So the idea of using tax policy to drive behavior or to come out with certain societal outcomes is absolutely fair game, because that's been used all along.
And we should come back to that, because one of the big fights this year will be the tax code. This is the year that the Trump tax cuts from the first Trump administration expire. And these are the lowest rates for billionaires and corporations that we've had in 100 years in this country. And so people often ask, how do you pay for this? And the answer is, you don't have the lowest rates on billionaires and corporations at this incredibly wealth-generating moment, right? And so that is a very live fight, because as you're saying, the tax code is a moral document.
Yeah.
It shows where our values are.
Totally. And we've taken a diversion. We'll come back to inheritance in Connecticut in a second. But while we're on the income, one of the things we wanted to discuss was, how are you going to pay for universal basic income or an income guarantee? The tax code is probably the way, tax credits, whatever. But the idea of a floor for income being paid for by a tax, basically payment, for a family or an individual who isn't at the poverty level, has been around for a very long time and debated for a very long time. Where's that discussion today? I mean, Trump aside, amongst people like yourself who are promoting it, is that popular, or do you want to finance? Do you think there's better ways of financing it, rather than, I guess it'd be a negative income tax, is what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of a negative income tax. If that were like on the
if we could get
topic debate right now, but we are nowhere near that.
But nowhere near. Okay,
right now.
So that's the answer.
Yeah, we are, on one hand saying it's very important to center the American working class, and on the other hand, writing a tax code that does the exact opposite of that. So that's the world that we're living in. How do you pay for it is, I think, one thing that's like on a lot of our minds. And frankly, what I say is that anytime this country decides that something is important, this country finds the money for it, whether it be wars or manufacturing chips right here in America, because we know it's a national security concern to be able to access chips which will power the 21st century. All of that funding is found for the minute it's deemed important. And so there are think tanks after think tanks with shelves of ideas of how you would shift the tax code to generate billions and billions of dollars to fund the types of things that we want to see. An example is a financial transaction tax. It's a tax, a small fee on high-frequency trading, generate billions of dollars.
On the throughput that happens every day in the market, right? Tiny little percentage on the volume traded.
Yes, we just need
Huge
the political will
amounts
to
of
get
money.
there. So the question is not how to pay for it. The question is how do we generate the political will to pay for it?
Even if they were to do that, to have the consensus to spend it on this versus something else.
Right. That's right. So let's go back to baby bonds, shall
Yeah.
we? All right, so here, this white paper's written. Okay, it gets into the zeitgeist, ideas, people start talking about it, Vox writes pieces on, this idea of a guaranteed inheritance. Piketty, this is around the time Piketty's book comes out and becomes like a very head-scratching bestseller because people are really interested, right, in these questions of capital and accumulation and wealth globally. And Cory Booker runs for president on this idea in 2016. Is that right, or 2020?
2020, I think.
2020, the primary of ideas. And Connecticut is, the state treasurer in Connecticut decides this is something we're going to be the first to do. Connecticut is a state with great wealth and great poverty. It's got a lot of discrepancy, and it's small, contained, So let's do this. And passes baby bonds. And the first baby born into this world where you have a trust established, I think was last year. It's taken some time. And other states have followed suit. California, 2 cycles ago, established a baby bond for children whose parent died of COVID or are exiting the foster care system. This was Nancy Skinner's bill, who was our state senator, termed out, but represented Berkeley. She passed it through the state house, and that's just a really exciting example. Washington, D.C. I had the opportunity, like I said, to travel the country, and there are a number of other state treasurers who are really excited about this idea. So to me, this is the laboratories of democracy, right? You've gone from a white paper to the ideas to states having created the model. And so in a moment of political opportunity, often fueled by crisis, often fueled sometimes by a big sea change and electorally, in a moment of political opportunity, this is an idea we'll be able to pick up and scale.
Yep. Connecticut had 2 other fun facts that I thought were cool, and you might be interested too. So I'm going to add on to her telling the story. They float a $50 million bond to pay for it, and it's probably a social impact bond, which I have some personal exposure to them, having done on other social issues that White & Case provided some pro bono guidance for them, because we were brought in by, of all things, the investment bank HSBC, who was the bank that was going to do the social impact bond for them. This was providing, scaling up a Yale program, to your point about the increasing number of collaborations to try to get the great ideas from academia out into the world, and the increasing receptivity, despite current ostrich behavior by business, to be engaged in that. And they had a program that Yale had shown if a home health care aide could go into a home on a very regular basis where the parent was alcoholic but in treatment, rather than take the child out, the outcomes were exactly what you would want and not what you wouldn't want, where if you took the child out, put them in the foster system, the outcomes were awful, right? And so they scaled this up a great deal, but they had to pay for it. They used a social impact bond, and HSBC and White & Case did that for free for them. So that kind of thing is happening in the real world, and good for Connecticut for being out there doing a number of these things. I think the other thing was that when you use your money that's in your fund that Connecticut gave you, you have to do it in the state. Go to school in the state or start your business in the state. So that's fair game.
Yeah, it's a way of trying to keep talent at home, which I think is really important to, California is not, we're where people are moving, but other states are trying, and in fact, that's a number of governors and mayors who are interested in things like the child tax credit or some of the housing work. They're doing it to entice people to stay and to build the local economies there.
Yeah. So we both are familiar with, and your book is filled with examples of pretty large scale, but still not the whole U.S., pilots or projects that showed that the behavior of individuals who benefited from the guarantees was not what, the worst naysayers would predict or sneeringly describe in ways of spending it on alcohol or drugs or whatever, right? To just lay it out there. That didn't happen. But do you have a concern that there would be, and perhaps that's not the unintended consequence that might actually happen, but are there other kinds of behaviors, or is there concern amongst the public policy folks or academia, if it's given broader implementation, that behavior might be different than what you've seen so far? Or how do you answer that concern?
Well, one of the things that there's a real question around work. Will people continue working? And we find overall that people absolutely continue working, but they might take one less shift. They might drop a third job, for example, which I think we as people who believe in community and believe in democracy, all of those things require time and energy. I think we would want a world where one job is enough, where people are working, 8 hours a day, and that provides them to put roofs over their heads and to put food on the table. And not a world where people are having to really, slave away to the paycheck. So I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves, because, sometimes the numbers will show, there was a slight reduction in work when those child tax credits went out. And what we'll find is it may be a single mother not working a third shift. And I think we as a society should say that's good.
I would be with you on that one for sure. One thing before we switch gears a little bit, your term, as we emailed beforehand, is that you feel that an economic floor is crucial for democracy.
Yeah.
Talk to me more about that. Why are they so linked?
Yeah. We are currently living in a world that is the downstream impacts of the last 50 years of trickle-down economics. And we are living in a world where people are broke, they're in debt, and our society and democracy is brittle. And that is making people much more open to strongman arguments and authoritarianism. And so I think there's a real downward spiral here where people don't trust institutions. Institutions don't work for them. They don't show up politically, and they continue to be moved out of, of the pie. And I think there is an upward spiral that's possible where people trust institutions, the institutions work for them, and they're more politically engaged and therefore have a bigger piece of the pie. That is where you have the economy and democracy deeply interlinked. And I also think, just from a fundamental perspective, the time piece here is really important. The less income you have, the more expensive everything is, and the more it takes time. Like, rich people are able to concierge their way out of waiting in long lines, being on hold to get what you need, at all times. The website not working over and over again. And it's expensive, and it takes a lot of time. And so I think time is crucial to democracy, right? It takes time to show up to your PTA, to be involved in your church or your synagogue or your community. And it certainly takes time to vote and to do the work of civic engagement. And if no one has it, then it's not possible.
True. So how can business help? How is business hurting? What's the role of business in this agenda?
Well, Joe, I'd actually turn that to you to tell us the answer to that.
This wasn't pre-discussed.
You've spent 30 years, I think, answering that exact question. Are you up for it?
Okay, I'll give you 2 seconds. I think that business can play a huge role here, and I think that we were on a trajectory where business was starting to move in that direction, and I believe that it will get momentum again, but I think right now we're on hold, which will move us into the next question, which is, okay, so now Trump is reelected, and that's a drag for lots of reasons. But for this agenda, it's pretty fatal for hopes of federal, action during his tenure.
Yeah.
You do make an interesting, very strong point in your book about, what did you call it, progressive democracy? No, it's about the states.
Oh, yeah, like progressive federalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah.
But just in general, how are you having to rethink things right now for what you do now?
Yeah. Well, I want to say one other thing on the business question, too, which is, I think...
And I can say more later. But
yeah, well, I'm genuinely
get through all
excited
our
to hear.
Questions for...
I do think there is a world where we expect, like, businesses run by the rules of the road that we as society have set.
Very
and
true.
that's actually their job. And we somehow expect them to just sort of out of the goodness of their heart do X, Y, or Z, when actually we just need to change the rules of the road.
Exactly.
And I think it'd be great for business leaders not to fight against that. So when there is a tax fight, yeah, businesses should pay taxes into this country to have a working democracy where people have what they need and frankly can buy their product in that way. So I think it is, I want to see leadership from businesses on policy issues. Like, it would have been fantastic to have more of a business voice around the expanded child tax credit. Mm-hmm. Privately they would say to us, we're very interested in that. Of course, we think it's great. It's good for the local economy. It's good for families to have more money. It's good for our workers to have more money. And yet they weren't showing up in the policy arena saying that. And so I do wish we could see more leadership. But frankly, the broader point is, it's incumbent upon us to change the rules of the road. How do we get this done is ultimately your question. Well, I think that this is going to be a very, very chaotic 4 years. Mm-hmm. And there is an opportunity, I think, to build during this time in communities and in states and in cities to turn to each other and build so that when the next moment, because, if you remember, COVID hit at the end of the Donald Trump presidency. Mm-hmm. And I actually think we had an extraordinarily fast vaccine, okay? And there is a lot that can be argued about how that happened, but that was government playing a role in shaping the market and saying, people need these vaccines, they need them fast, private industry, we need you to step up and focus, and then we're gonna give it to Americans for free. We're going to mobilize the National Guard, and we're going to create lines where you can go and get this vaccine for free. That is just a taste of a guarantee of healthcare, of what it could look like in this country. Now, I'm not crediting Donald Trump, and I'm saying that there was a lot of that started under that administration that certainly the next administration continued on. So I think that over the next 4 years, the job is really to build for the next political opportunity that arises.
Yeah, fair enough. A careers question, and then we'll open it to questions from the group, and we can keep going as well, but I do know that we'll hope that others will have questions, so be thinking what you want to ask Natalie. If students want to build their careers in this field or to have their avocation outside of their work be working towards this agenda, what advice would you have for them?
That's such a great question. Well, I think there's a lot of room. I've spent most of my career inside of the nonprofit social sector world. And there's a lot of room for people who understand business to come and help build revenue streams, to take the mindset of, lean prototyping and other things into the creation of products inside of, the nonprofit space. This week, I got to spend some time with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, led by Aijin Pu, and she was bringing a number of caregivers to the Bay Area to do a tour of AI. They met with Anthropic in the morning, they met with Google in the afternoon, and the idea was that caregivers deserve a seat at the table as AI is being developed in their workplace, which is largely the home or in other care facilities. Care is often understood to be one of the jobs that will not be automated. It is the job we will want human beings to do. So it stands to be a growth is a growth job in this country, but AI will undoubtedly impact and already is scheduling, and it will augment the ways in which people work. So caregivers deserve a seat at that. I thought that was such a great thing to do, and there were a number of business leaders there engaging in that question and working inside of National Domestic Workers Alliance, running labs, technologists who were running labs, creating product, that kind of thing. So I think there's room for you inside of the social sector. And if you choose to pursue a career in business, then I think the question is, please be a business leader that supports social policy that makes sure that everyone can thrive.
All right. We have a mic here. Do we have someone who's going to, you, John? Thank you. So who has a question to start us off?
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much. You're both amazing. I have a question on those spirals you were talking about. I took a class with Robert Reich this past semester, and we were talking a lot about this downward spiral, where, people feel excluded from the current systems, and instead of trying to fix the current system, it seems like they are trying to, vote for an outsider, who then comes in and largely implements policies that are continuing the current system that has created the problems that we see today. So I've also been studying systems change and trying to think about this future of trying to reverse that spiral upwards. And a lot of the times I conclude that we might need a disaster, much worse than COVID, right? Like, we need to have ashes to rise from. But do you have a vision? I'm also in this class called Designing Futures, and we want to think about a future that we want to see so we can manifest it.
Yeah.
And I just find that a lot rarer. Robert Reich had an idea that we could do economic populism, and do a Bernie Sanders type revival. But what do you think about when you think about starting this upward spiral?
Well, one, the point you're making about dreaming the future is really important. And I'm very interested in, people having space and time to dream their own futures. That not just being a product of a small sliver of people who have enough, but that's widely democratized, that people can dream their own futures. And then a collective future comes from that. So I also think, I think you may be right that it will require, some sort of crisis. But I think we should prepare for we can do both things. We can believe that there is a possibility of shifting. This country has had major shifts in how we've understood social policy, right? The ones I'm talking about, the neoliberalism and trickle-down economics, which has been the dominant system for the last 50 years, was not the dominant system 100 years ago, right? During so much of the New Deal era. And there was a clear sense that government has a role to ensure that we can build a middle class, that we can support unions. Now, at that time, it was done largely for white families. I do believe there is a way to do it in a multiracial context for the 21st century, learning from what went poorly then. And, it was absolutely after a war. There were a number of exogenous factors, but there have been big shifts in how norms are created. Even Social Security, which is like a norm today, we all understand as a bedrock, was a radical idea at one time. It was this doctor in Southern California who all these people were moving to Southern California to retire, and it was during the Depression, and they lost everything. And he looked around and was like, what are we going to do about this? There's all these poor old people who can't work. This is a real problem. And he looked over at post-war Germany, where they had instituted a social insurance program, and he started advocating for a social insurance program right here in America. And he did this before the internet, before WhatsApp. Like, they created chapters all over the country. They wrote letters, and Social Security was created in a moment of crisis in this country. It was created small, a small payroll tax that then was built on and has just become a norm. We understand it to be a bedrock of the social contract in this country. So I'm hopeful that there is that path forward. And I understand that there might not be. Either way, we have to have the blueprints that we build in those moments. That's what I would say.
With a lot of these guarantees at risk currently, I was wondering if you have any suggestions for how lawmakers can reframe them to be perhaps more bipartisan or another strategy so that these programs are less likely to be dismantled.
Yeah, terminology.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, honestly, let's take the case of the child tax credit, for example. When I say the words to you, expanded child tax credit, I don't think that invokes a sense of radical, shifts or radical change, because it is what happened when the idea of a guaranteed income, which is sort of in the margins, moved into the mainstream. And when it became in the purview of the policy lane, it was understood, okay, we'll do it inside the tax credit, we'll shift it this way. Yep. And I think it was also because that's the sort of the way in which you could imagine Republicans and Democrats supporting the idea. Now, Republicans did not show up to vote for that, despite their rhetoric of being pro-family. And I'm just like, not one voted for the expanded child tax credit. And every Democrat except one voted for it. And that one was Joe Manchin. And that is why we do not have the expanded child tax credit today in America. So I think that terminology does matter. And there needs to be, I think there needs to be more of movement right of center to hold the Republican Party accountable to their pro-family rhetoric. Yeah.
We have one over here. No?
I'm going to ask one. It's not fully formulated, and maybe other people in the room have a response to it. But something that I am thinking of, and the questions have been around this, around narrative, and I think you've also talked a lot about that, is like, what story are we telling? And the folks who I've met here at Haas, sorry, I'm a full-time first-year MBA student, for the most part are like, yeah, I want to do good in the world. I really do, right? Like, there's a problem and I want to fix it. And I think also they're here because we have narratives of what success and merit and what that looks like in our society. And so I wonder, and I think there's a fetishization of millionaires and billionaires. And I think a lot of my classmates want to be that. And I don't fault them because, who wouldn't want to have money? That sounds really nice. But I'm just wondering, like I said, not fully formulated, but if there are conversations you've had where you're able to like draw upon the information that you have to be able to kind of push people a little bit to take some kind of action, whether it's the policy action or whether it literally is. I have a friend who recently told me, I have my representatives' phone numbers on my phone. And I just call them. I call them regularly, right?
God bless them.
And we meet Wednesday nights, and we have snacks, and me and a few friends, and we just give them calls. And I don't know that people are engaged that way. I don't know that people really understand that that's like a lever we can push. That's a lever. There's also business levers, right? So I'll stop talking now.
Yeah. And of course, you were the digital lead for Organizing for America for President Obama.
Yeah.
So you've asked the right person the right question.
I mean, I absolutely think that we have, so many, like poll after poll shows that people hope someday they too will win this rigged game. And that is why you have currently, like, Elon Musk in the position he's at, all the tech titans, front and center in the inauguration. There is a fetishization of that, undoubtedly, because people want the security that comes with that. And so I think the shift is saying, oh, this game is rigged. You will not get that. Unless, but what we can have is a world where everybody has enough or more than enough. It's possible to do that. We're currently on track. Oxfam, the NGO, just put out a report they put out every year on the state of global inequality and wealth. They do it around Davos. And they are saying that in the next decade, we will have 5 trillionaires if tax policy continues the way it is. And when one person amasses so much money, more money than many small countries around the globe, it is hard to even understand what $1 trillion is, right? It is a millions, right?
I don't know, 100 million? I don't know.
It is
it's
a lot of money. It's 1,000 billion.
Exponentially more than $1 billion.
That it's not, that means, right, that it's a small number of people having everything. And that is not a world where a functioning democracy and certainly economic security can be shared. Or an oligarchy.
Oligarchy,
yeah.
Oligarchy.
As Joe Biden warned us of in the last days in office, that we are entering an oligarchic period.
There are powerful people, though, who are aware of this, who are bothered seriously by the inequities in society and are thoughtful and in playing leadership roles in continuing this dialogue and calling for specific kinds of change. And then there's also the European Union. So first, the European Union. Any big company wants to sell in 2 markets, California and Europe. And so you manage to the standard that is set in terms of the whole set of guardrails and guidelines and rules that a company has to operate under. I'm not saying you can't pay a lower than living wage in a poor country for your supply chain where that is the local wage. That's not considered to be responsible business, but it may be legal, right? But so I don't want to say you manage to the highest standard that you have to operate under as a blanket statement, because that's not true. But in general, with some exceptions, you generally do manage to the highest standard that you have to report for or that the market requires you to manage, report, disclose, remedy. The categories in the guiding principles, the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and underlying most disclosure due diligence requirements around environmental sustainability. And there's a ton of that in law now in the European Union and the UK. So companies that are global, that are headquartered in the US, are definitely continuing to operate according to that because they have to report on their global results, not just their results in France, but their global operations in order to continue to have a license to operate in France. And those laws and regulations are getting meatier and meatier with more teeth by the day, by the year. You can now be sued in France for various types of what they consider to be out of bounds, which would not be anything like what would be considered out of bounds in the US. So we're stratifying the rules for business and corporate governance a great deal now more due to globalization than they ever were before. So that's something to keep in mind, and I think that's a very big pressure on big business. The oligarchs right now are trying to get the rules that they want, especially in the new areas. Tax policy, yes, but also AI and regulation of tech and whether a social media platform is a bulletin board or a publisher. You know, that's what they want out of this administration right now, and they're trying to get that. But that doesn't mean that they're having the same effect in the European Union. So keep that in mind, and my class does cover that material. But the other thing is, in this country, there's a judge named Leo Strine, who is now retired as the head judge of Chancery Court in Delaware. And he was on the Supreme Court in Delaware as well. He is a senior partner at Wachtell. I wished he'd have joined White and Case, but unfortunately no. And he launched a campaign. It's been going on for a few years now. He speaks widely, he writes widely on how corporate governance law, it needs to change in the US. And he believes so strongly in taking the unintended consequences and non-financial impacts of a business into account, and that it needs, the C-suite needs to become aware of and have actual rules on it, that it is responsible for its externalities in a defined way that's still emerging, right? But the classical economics would tell you, well, companies aren't responsible for their externalities. That's how we got in this problem, right? Government is going to regulate it, right? They can pay whatever wages they want within a certain bounds, pretty low. We've emerged with health and safety to what became CSR to what's now ESG, because the externalities of business are too big, because business is too good. Business is a great way of meeting our needs. There's money in toothpaste because before we had toothpaste, our teeth fell out, right? There's a real good that it provides. There's value, the profit comes from the value, right? But now we're realizing that those externalities need to be dealt with by business in a way that we never called on them to do that. And Judge Strine is in the forefront of that. And when you say the guy who used to preside over this regime is now saying ESG is actually too narrow. He wants it to be EESG, so it's environmental, social, and governance. And he wants to add an E to call out employees. He's very, very concerned about the demise of unions in this country and blames a lot of the economic disparities that have emerged on the demise of the unions, which also coincides with the rise of neoliberalism and the Reagan administration. So I would just point out that there are people out there that are powerful, who are still there despite the current administration, and they're not going away either. And then there's the European Union, and that's going to matter to big companies a lot. So what else have we got? Persis.
I have a question. You didn't really touch on housing, but I know it's one of the guarantees.
Oh, that's another guarantee.
So I'm curious, there are researchers like Matthew Desmond who point to the fact that the tax credit that homeowners benefit from actually makes it really hard to build, because it takes away from the scarcity of their home ownership. They want to hang on to the value in their homes. And that tax credit is an incentive away from actually expanding the pool of available housing. So in situations like this, where the tax credit incentives that benefit people actually undermine the greater good, do you feel like there are some other examples of that where, on paper, we can change the tax code and, it might benefit the upper middle class, but it will actually undermine the greater social cause? Can you speak to that a little bit, and how maybe the guarantee or this floor of guaranteed housing might be impacted by that?
Yeah. Well, Matthew Desmond certainly, the Evicted was a really big influence as I was writing the guarantee, and he came out with Poverty by America a little bit before too. And he's digging into a lot of this, and I'm really glad to see his lab looking at. He's also looking at the connection between democracy and foreclosures and evictions and housing. I think broadly on housing, it's much bigger than tinkering with the tax code. I think we have to do three things. One, we have to produce more housing. So we just need to be building housing in America. And we are, by some estimates, 6 million units short. That couldn't be more acute right here in the Bay Area. It's dense housing that is needed. There was a wonderful Washington Post headline recently that's like, maybe the new American dream needs to be the townhome, which is exactly right, that is what we should be shooting for. And it would certainly make us more connected as human beings. The other things we need to do, though, are also to protect renters who are incredibly vulnerable in this housing system that is left entirely to the market at this point. There's very little sense of government having a role. And then the third thing we have to do is protect the existing affordable housing and build more of it. So it's the 3 Ps that kind of came out of an era of consensus building here in California. Produce more housing, protect renters, and preserve the existing affordable housing. So I'm interested in all of that. There's a lot of work happening to make that happen. I think it's the only way we get to the housing guarantee. But the story I'll tell, to just put a finer point on it, is in Montgomery County, Maryland. And again, this is a story that's happening regardless of who's president in this country. The housing authority there said, government has a really important way of financing housing that we should be using more. And so they've done that. And they are financing and building housing that is kept off the speculative market. And it's for middle-income Marylanders. It's right on a transit line. They're breaking ground on zero-carbon buildings. And if you move in, if you get one of those units, your rent is held stable. And so I think of this as a public option for housing. It's government saying we are going to compete in this market that is primarily driven by the private market, and we are going to create a baseline of housing that will support middle-income Marylanders and low-income Marylanders, and then the private market can build around it, and it will force rents down and shape the market in ways that I think are really helpful, that I think gets us closer to a housing guarantee. So Montgomery County, Maryland, you don't have to travel to Vienna or other cities that have social housing in vast abundance. You can now see it being built right here in the US.
How's the zoning fights going? Zoning is the other thing, right?
Very much so. So are you all familiar with sort of the YIMBY movement? A couple of nods. Zoning in America for a very long time was only allowed single-family housing in many neighborhoods. So it meant you couldn't build dense housing at all. And I think St. Paul was the first city to shift that, to ban zoning that only allowed single-family homes, and many other cities are following suit. But it's hard because housing is historically understood as a local issue in America, one that cities and neighborhoods get to determine for themselves, which is why you have the sort of not in my backyard, NIMBY, anti-building experience in this country.
Yeah. Any final questions? And John, you could wrap us up whenever you're ready to do that.
Sounds good. Any last questions? All right.
I can just stop talking.
Use the microphone.
So despite these times we are in, do you have hope for the future of this guaranteed economy?
Yeah. Activist Mariama Kaba has a phrase that has really stuck with me. That is, hope is a discipline. It is a discipline. It is not some days come easy when you wake up and you see, all government spending has halted, and then actually, no, it hasn't, or maybe, you see the news of the day, and it doesn't come easy, but it's a discipline that we have to cultivate, because we are in this project that has never been tried before in the world, which is to create a multiracial democracy. We'll be the first if we can figure this out. And so I do have a lot of hope that some of the brightest minds in this country are focused on that. I think that the voters said loud and clear that 50 years of neoliberalism is not working for them. I think they've said it election after election after election. But they've been very clear that they would rather burn it all down than continue on the path that we're on. And so I think there's just a lot of, Mr. Rogers also said, in moments of crisis, look for the helpers. And the helpers right now are around, and they're building, and they're in this room, and they're doing, Wednesday nights, calling your members of Congress, and they're doing mutual aid in LA, and they're figuring out how Altadena doesn't get entirely bought out by private equity, but instead can support the incredibly important and vibrant neighborhoods, the historically Black neighborhoods that built wealth there for generations. So those are the places that give me hope and how I cultivate that discipline.
Well, you certainly are a helper.
Well,
So thank
You
you
too,
for spending your time with us tonight.
Please join me in the
Thank you.
I'd also like to give another round of applause for Persis and the Center for Responsible Business for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I am going to advance this slide. The QR code. Please fill out this post-event survey. This is so important for us. It helps us put on these events. And additionally, you should be able to put in your email address so that you can join the new Coalition for Responsible Business. We need to build the movement. This is all about organizing and building the movement to work together, and that can happen right here. And I believe that is it. We're going to be in here until 7 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming. We have another event coming up on Tuesday night. We have a film showing hosted by our own Reese in the audience. And then hold the date, April 30th, will be over in Speaker Forum for innovations and ownership models, which is going to be so exciting. Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful for you all to be here. Thank you again to Natalie and Joe.